Good morning. It is great to be here again this morning as we continue our Back to the Future study, a series in the book of Genesis. Hopefully you've been enjoying it. We're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 11, actually on just the end of where we finished out last week. So go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 11. Our talk this morning is called Promises. Last month, we took some of the students from the youth group here to New York City. And while we were in New York City, we were serving with First Baptist Church of Manhattan. That church was actually started in the 1700s, early 1700s, before the United States even existed as a country. And they were meeting there and gathering there, and then in mid to late 1800s, the church finally built some land in the center of Manhattan and built this gorgeous cathedral, this beautiful church. As you can see, the ceiling is actually stained glass. They had stained glass everywhere. They had different inscriptions, all of it pointing to who God is and just their joy and their delight to worship Him and to gather, and generation after generation would gather there in this church. When they built this building, it was the tallest building in New York City, believe it or not. And it was like maybe 3 stories. And it was the tallest building. It was right in the center of Manhattan. It's clear that what was central for these people was the worship of God. Everything revolved around the Christian religion. First Baptist was placed at a strategic location. It was the tallest building in the city at that point. People were baptized there. They were saved there. They would worship there. They were married there. They would confess their sins there. They were buried there. And it was this focal point of the city at that time. But if you're to go to New York City today, what would the tallest buildings be? You would see these massive skyscrapers of banks and international corporations. You would find the New York Stock Exchange. You would find these apartments filled with people that are trying to make it in the city that never sleeps. You would find this city has completely shifted. Our culture has completely shifted. Our society is going a different way as far as what is most important. Life is no longer centered on God and the church, but rather on these corporations that sponsor materialism and consumerism. You see, the reality is more and more churches have dropped in attendance. More and more churches have closed their doors. More and more churches are being turned into storefronts and in New York City, apartment complexes and all these other things for other purposes. And so it begs the question, has the virus of materialism and consumerism also infected us? Has it infected us to the point that we are no longer passionate about God's church? To where we are no longer excited about outreach? Where we're no longer excited about this mission to share the gospel with people? Like, think about when you were first saved, when you first came into a relationship with Jesus. And I love seeing when a young kid gets saved, right? And they're just ecstatic. Like, they tell everyone, like, I accepted Jesus into my heart. And they're thrilled. But then as time goes on and we face these pressures of the world that we live in, does consumerism and materialism perhaps sap that joy out of our lives? Are we perhaps more interested in seeking the good life than in seeking God's kingdom? Let's begin reading in chapter 11, verse 27. This is the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still living. Meanwhile, Abraham and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah and her sister Iscah were daughters of Nahor's brother Haran. But Sarai was unable to become pregnant and had no children. One day, Terah took his son Abram and his daughter-in-law Sarai, and his son Abram's wife, and his grandson Lot, his son Haran's child, and moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans. he was headed for the land of Canaan, but they stopped at Haran and settled there. Terah lived for 205 years, and he died while still in Haran. We read this, and it's right on the back end of our study last week about the Tower of Babel. Sin has continued to grow rampant. Originally, God created this perfect paradise, as we talked about in week 1. And that paradise was lost. Adam and Eve sinned, and God threw them out of paradise. And then sin continued to grow and continued to grow. And as the wickedness of mankind came, God sent a flood to clean the earth of its sin and its wickedness. And he only spared Noah, who he looked at him and said he's a righteous man, and he spares Noah and his family. And God starts completely fresh. It's just this family, this righteous family, and things start promising. Like Noah gets off the ark and immediately builds this altar to the Lord. Like he has a big worship service for God. And so it's like, man, this is great. This is really good. And then like a couple generations later, it's just chaos again. Mankind again falls back into sin. We talked about that last week with the Tower of Babel. They were called to scatter, to fill the earth as representatives of God, and instead they came together and they gathered in one place. Direct disobedience. So God goes and he confuses their tongues, and he intentionally then scatters them to be representatives of him. So then God, a third time, comes to start fresh with a guy that we're going to look at today named Abram. And this man is an unlikely candidate because it says that he was raised here, born in Ur of the Chaldeans. That's Babylon. That's the same place that God confused the tongues. So Abram's family is there, and despite God's judgment at the Tower of Babel, confusing their tongues and scattering people, they still didn't worship the one true God. In fact, it says this about Abram and his family. It says in Joshua, Joshua said to the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River, and they worshipped other gods." You see, Abraham is not a God follower at this point. Abraham, in fact, is worshiping pagan gods. Abraham's a heathen. This is complete grace that God would call an idolater named Abram. God's call of Abraham, or Abram, is a new beginning, and it's going to require a major test of obedience. So let's continue reading this story into chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous. And you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you." So Abraham departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all of his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and he headed for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abraham traveled through the land of Shechem. Then he set up camp beside the oak of Moreh. At that time, the area was inhabited by Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "I will give this land to your descendants." And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. After that, Abram traveled south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord. Then Abraham continued traveling south by stages toward the Negev. We come to this story, and Abraham is living with his family in their homeland. They had started out in Ur of the Chaldeans. They moved, but they had set up their roots. And so he's living at home with his family, and things are good for him. I mean, he has a wife. He has property. He has wealth. He has family. He has more wealth to come because this inheritance he will receive from his dad when his dad passes away at the age of 205. That's a long time to be alive. But he's got all this stuff. Life is good. In many ways, he's living the dream, or what we might call the American dream. I mean, he even had his religion. Like, he was good. He was all set. And then out of nowhere, God approaches him. And this wasn't just one of the many gods that Abraham normally worshiped. This was the one true God. And God comes to Abram, and he offers him a covenant. But this covenant requires a great sacrifice, because God is asking him to make a complete break from his past. So we see this great sacrifice, and there's going to be three aspects to the sacrifice that we're going to look at. The first is that Abram is called to abandon his land. See, we can hardly imagine the difficulty of this request. We live in a nation that was birthed out of immigration, where people moved to this place for a better life, for religious freedoms, for whatever it might be. It continues to this day. But we also live in a very highly mobile society, right? So Anna and I, for instance, have moved 550 miles from our homeland. I'm not saying I'm Abraham. I'm just saying we moved 550 miles from our homeland. But guess what? The other week, it was 4th of July week. The office was closed, and so Anna and I drove home and spent time with family and friends. In between that time, when we don't get to see them or they're not coming down visiting, we have cell phones. We can shoot text messages. We can make phone calls. We can FaceTime. My grandmother, I email. She does email, not texting. But we keep up. We live in a highly mobile society. So trying to fathom the difficulty of this would be very difficult, because we don't live in the ancient Near East. Back then, people stayed in their country. They stayed with their family. It was familiar territory. It was your livelihood. It was your security. You see, their roots ran deeper than we can ever know. Abandoning the land was a complete break. It was a complete stepping away from everything that was familiar. And they didn't travel by plane or by car. They traveled by camel or by foot. They didn't have snail mail even. Like, this was a complete break. Leaving his land was a great sacrifice. And it also meant abandoning his family. You see, God requested Abram to up and leave. And he didn't say, hey, pack up your whole family and leave. He said, leave your family. Leave your family, leave your relatives. You see, I think this could resonate with you a little bit more here. In this community, family ties are strong. Like, children and parents and grandchildren and brothers and sisters spend a lot of time together. Like, family is everything. And that's how it was for Abram. Life revolved around the family. The family name was his very identity. In the Hebrew, his name is actually Abram ben Terah. It means Abraham, son of Terah. Like, that was his name. It'd be like the name Hefner around here, right? Like, it's everywhere. You can't escape it. And that's kind of what's going on here. It's your identity was found in your family. Leaving his family was also a great sacrifice. But it also meant to leave your family was to abandon his inheritance. You see, it says, leave your land, leave your relatives, and leave your family's house. And it sounds redundant, like, why is he repeating, like, this family's family? Like, what, like relatives, family, like they're the same thing. It's not redundant. It's pulling on a different aspect of what's going on here. Because for Abram, father's family is pulling on the fact that everything his father has is his. His father's house was his house. His father's goods were his goods. His father's cattle was his cattle. His father's wealth was his wealth. His father's name was his name. Leaving his land and family also meant walking away from a great inheritance. And this too is a huge sacrifice, a great sacrifice. To us, this request would come and it's like, man, that'd be pretty tough. Like, moving that far away from family, and it's a complete break, so like I don't get any inheritance, like completely foreign land. This would be hard. But in the ancient Near East, this is nearly impossible to ask somebody to do this. It's a great sacrifice. It's a huge sacrifice. Leave your land, your relatives, your inheritance. And it says this, and go to a land that I will show you. What? Are you kidding me? Like, the tension is raised here. There is no certainty. He didn't say, hey, pick up and move to California. He said, pick up and move, and someday I'll show you where you're going. Like, what? That's crazy. This is absurd. This is a huge request. This isn't immigration to the riches of the United States. Abraham is asked to blindly follow God. But God asks for this great sacrifice, but not without offering greater promises. You see, these sacrifices are met with greater promises, and the promises are sevenfold. He says this. He says, first, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you. You're going to be famous. You will bless others. I'm going to bless those who bless you. I'm going to curse those who curse you. And ultimately, through you, the entire earth will be blessed. 7 promises. In the Scriptures, 7 is the number of completion, the number of perfection. You see, God's promise isn't just greater. God's promise is perfect. And God comes to Abram and he says, look, I got this 7-fold promise for you. But yes, it does require great sacrifice. So how does this relate to the first 3 sacrifices he has to make? First, he's promised to receive a new land that's going to be a better land. It's the reversal of the curse from Genesis 3. You see, God promises to deliver Abram into a land that will be fertile, a land where his crops will grow bountifully, the place where his animals will always have enough food, the place where he'll always be able to provide for his family, and it's going to be easier than anywhere else. It's this beautiful land. Work will be easier, as Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 8, speaking of this land. He says this, for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land of flowing streams and pools of water, with fountains and springs that gush out in the valleys and the hills. It is a land of wheat and barley, of grapevines, fig trees and pomegranates, of olive oil and honey. And then it goes on to say that it's this beautiful land where nothing is lacking. It's like a new paradise. And God promises this to Abram. But there's another significance to this, and that's that ever since Genesis chapter 3, man has only related to land as far as being driven out. Right? So Adam and Eve are driven out of the Garden of Eden. Cain kills his brother, he's driven out. We talked about that last week. They continually move eastward, further and further away from paradise, the place that God had made for humanity. And now God, instead of driving people out of the land, he's now going to bring Abram to a land. That's significant. These promises are great, but it seems rather idealistic, right? God says, go somewhere that I'll show you sometime. Like, I can't put that in my GPS, God. I need a little instruction here. Like, Garmin's not going to pick that one up. They're going to say, like, need a destination. It's not going to work. And yet, Abraham is told to go, even though he didn't know where. And he's told that when he goes, he'll receive a better land. But that's not it. The next part of the promise is that he'll receive a new family, a bigger family, in fact, a family that will become a great nation. Like God says, hey, leave the family that you have behind, and I'll give you a new family. Again, idealistic promise, right? Like we read that Sarai is unable to have children. Not to mention, Abraham's 75 years old and he's not getting any younger. And God says, hey, by the way, if you make this great sacrifice your family, I'm going to give you a bigger family. And Abraham had to be like scratching his head like, God, Sarah and I, like we've been married for a while. I don't know when they got married. Let's say 20 years old. It's been 55 years, God. We still don't have a kid. Like there's no little Abrams running around. So I'm not sure how you're going to accomplish this. How can God possibly make a great nation or even a small family out of an old man and a barren wife? But yet God promises a bigger family. And then God also promises that he would receive a new inheritance, a greater inheritance. You see, this inheritance that would be promised to him was not a blessing from his father, but a blessing from God. It was actually going to be not just a normal family inheritance, but a royal inheritance. This inheritance was going to be so great that it would not just be a blessing to Abram or to his family, but it would be an inheritance to the entire world. It would be a greater inheritance. So then the question is, what will Abraham do? What will Abraham do? I don't know about you, but I hear promises like this and like red flags start going up, right? Like, true story, this happened. Go to the Apple Festival. We filled out one of those little things, drop it in. Phone call. Hey, you want a free vacation and $250 in Visa gift cards? And I'm like, sweet, this is awesome. By the way, you have to come on this day, and when you show up, you'll only be able to stay this long. You have to go right home, and during the time that you're here, you're going to have to sit in seminars, and we're going to try to get you to buy stuff. I'm like, I didn't sign up for that. Like, that's not what I want. Like, where's the fine print here? Like, God, what's going on? Like, what are the strings that are attached? There's tons of questions. How will Abraham respond to this offer? We hardly even have time to wonder because the author immediately moves forward. There's a lot of questions and uncertainty surrounding God's command and his promises. This would require a great deal of faith. But nowhere do we see Abraham questioning God. We don't read about Abram sitting there at home having a conversation with his wife about what to do. We don't see him pondering all the different options here. We don't see him staying up at night, tossing and turning in bed like, I don't know what the right thing to do is. He encountered God. He saw God. God came to him. And quickly the author moves us forward into verse 4, where it says this, so Abraham departed as the Lord instructed. So Abraham departed as the Lord instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. The author adds emphasis to the fact that, like, this dude is getting old, and he just picks up and moves. Who does that? Who does that? It's simple. Abraham goes. So what will he do? He goes. It's simple obedience, just like before him, just like Noah did. Abram takes God at his word. And then this narrator informs us about the fact that he took his wife with him. He took Lot, his nephew, with him. That was the only family member he took with him. He took all of his servants with him. And this huge caravan moves some 400 miles from their homeland. And so they're moving. And what's interesting is this author takes one verse to cover 400 miles. One verse. It says that Abraham traveled through Shechem, and he headed for the land of Canaan. In verse 5, he headed to the land of Canaan when they arrived in Canaan. Like, it's literally like a half of this sentence and then a new sentence. He left, he arrived, boom, that's it. And it's like, oh, that's really interesting because, this is a huge caravan. This would have been a slow, long process. How many of you have ever caravanned with your family to vacation? Anybody in here? Like, raise your hand. Okay, good. I'm not alone. I remember doing this when I was 12 years old. We were going to the Outer Banks from Pennsylvania, so it was a long drive to begin with. And my grandparents paid for the whole family to caravan down to the Outer Banks. And I had some little cousins that couldn't hold their bladders, so we literally pull out from my grandparents' house before we could even get on the interstate. This was before cell phones were real prominent too, so we had walkie-talkies, right? So like radioed in like, hey, we need to stop at the bathroom. Somebody has to go. It's like, we just got on the road. This is crazy. But Abram is taking this entire caravan, and in one verse, he's in the land of Canaan. But I draw attention to that because then notice this. The author then, he covers 400 miles in one verse. And then he takes 4 verses to cover the last 75 miles. Why is that? It's because he wants to draw attention to Abram's actions here in the land. Emphasis is being given to what Abram does when he gets in Canaan. Why? Well, Canaan's this beautiful place. It's like this new paradise, and they arrive, and then what does it say? Because this delight is going to be short-lived, it says they arrived in Canaan, they traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There they set up camp next to the oak of Moreh. At this time, the land was inhabited by Canaanites. The delight was short-lived because as Abram sets up camp at this oak, he would have seen a shrine to pagan gods. This land was inhabited by the Canaanites. The Canaanites were relatives of Noah that were cursed because of their sin. They were the seed of the serpent, enemies of God. And so the author brings attention to that. And then notice what happens. God immediately comes to Abram, and he says, I will give you this land to you and your descendants. The tension is quickly resolved. So then what else does Abram do? He worships. It says that Abram responds to this gracious promise by building an altar to the Lord. Abram erects this place of worship, this house of worship, so to speak, before there was houses of worship. He celebrates who God is. Why does attention come to this? Because Abram is reclaiming the land for the Lord and his kingdom. In the midst of this other pagan temple, he's essentially saying, this is the Lord's land. Not yet, but someday it will be. It's kind of like the soldiers at Iwo Jima when they raised the flag during World War II. It was this great sacrifice to overtake this strategic island from where they would launch many more missions before the end of the war. It was this great sacrifice, but there was a greater promise. Once they received this, they were set in a strategic location. And so they raised the flag here, and that's essentially what Abram's doing. He's raising the flag in a strategic location in the promised land. And he's saying that this land is going to be reclaimed for God's kingdom. Unknown to Abram, he's offered the privilege and responsibility of being a royal line. You see, because through his family, God would establish the people of Israel. Imagine being an Israelite and reading this story, hearing this story about your father Abraham. The message would have been obvious. Because they're likely reading this right before they enter into the promised land, the land of Canaan. And they're hearing this, and they're realizing, man, God's promised us this land. Like, this is ours for the taking. Abram's already set up altars in the land, claiming it for the Lord. It's the very land that their fathers failed to have faith and wandered around the wilderness until every last one of them had died. And now this new generation waits for Joshua to lead them into the promised land. And they're thinking, it's finally happening. We're finally getting to enter into this land. But it's not just this land that God is interested in. Because remember the climax of his promise to Abram. That the whole world would be blessed through him. You see, Canaan is only the first step. Canaan is kind of like D-Day, right? In 1944, U.S. troops land on the shores of Normandy. And they have this huge celebration as they continue to push back the German forces. And they celebrate this, what we call D-Day, but D-Day wasn't the goal. It was only the first step to V-Day, where they would finally be victorious in overthrowing the Nazi regime. The goal was not Canaan, the goal was the entire earth. You see, eventually out of Israel would come the great King David. Then in time would come great David's greater son, Jesus Christ. We read this in Matthew chapter 1. This is a record of the ancestors of Jesus, the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. Abram prefigured his own seed, Jesus. It's through the son of Abram that God will restore his kingdom. It's through the son of Abram, Jesus Christ, that relationship with God can be restored, because God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. You see, Jesus died to pay for our sins, and he rose again to spread his kingdom. And he commands us. He commands us. He doesn't suggest. He doesn't encourage. He doesn't merely ask. He commands us as his followers to advance his kingdom. In Matthew 28, just before he ascends back into heaven, he tells his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. He says, "Teach these new disciples to obey all the commandments that I have given you. And be sure of this, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age." This command still applies to us. This is the lesson that we can take out of this, is as God called Abram to reclaim Canaan for his kingdom purposes, so does Jesus Christ call us to reclaim the whole world for his purposes. We're instructed then to see, worship, and tell of the greatness of God. See, worship, and tell of the greatness of God. But we're so easily distracted, right? We're so easily sucked into this consumerism and this materialism. We're sucked into it even in church. Like, is your mindset that the church is there for you? Or are you there for the church? You see the difference in thinking there? One is consumerism. The church is there to always feed me, to give me what I want, and then I'm out the doors and I live my life the rest of the week. Or the flip side is, am I there for the church? Would the church even realize if I stopped coming? Am I making a difference in God's kingdom purpose? Do I know the people that are sitting in the auditorium with me? Do I make a difference in their life? Or am I letting consumerism and materialism sap my gospel mission? What a glorious mission, but what a difficult mission it is. As difficult as it was for Abram to leave behind his past, his country, his family, his inheritance, his pagan gods, so Jesus reminds us that ours is a difficult mission as well. He says this in Matthew 10, 37 through 39. He says, "If you love your father or your mother more than me, you're not worthy of being mine. If you love your son or daughter more than me, you're not worthy of being mine. If you refuse to take up your cross and follow me, you're not worthy of being mine. If you cling to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for me, you will find it." You see, we have to lose our life and our self-interests and totally focus on worshiping God. You see, there was a time where in Manhattan, worship of God was everything. That's long been lost. And as the city goes, the nation goes. And I think that's fair to say. So what are you going to do? We have to give up our lives to his service. We're called to raise the flag of his kingdom in strategic places. Feeding the hungry through the Mobile Cafe is setting up his flag in a strategic place. Giving hope to the hopeless at Caring Hearts is lifting up God's flag in a strategic place. teaching the next generation to follow Jesus Christ with all of their lives through Crosspoint Kids or Exchange Youth Ministry is lifting up God's flag in a strategic place. Why should I get involved in this mission? Why shouldn't I just join in with society of pleasure seekers? Why not serve the gods of this age, materialism and consumerism? It's simple, because the gods of this life only lead to death. But the God of the universe offers life. You see, joining his mission places us on the winning side. It guarantees not D-Day, but V-Day, when he is ultimately victorious. Joining this mission gives us a single focus, and it fills our lives with meaning both now and for all of eternity. I love the quote by Jim Elliot. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. But the flip side of that would be, you're a fool if you hold on to the thing that you can't keep and in the end give up your life. Let us pray. God, I ask that you would help us to see, to worship, and tell of your greatness. God, that we would not let consumerism and materialism sap our joy and sap our kingdom passion, but that we would make it a priority to connect with other people and tell them our story, of your Son dying in our place. God, that we would set up these strategic flags in anticipation of V-Day, when you come again and bring home your people. We love you and we praise in your Son's name. Amen. We're going to close by worshiping and singing This Is Amazing Grace. And I think it's so fitting because Abraham being called by God was a complete act of grace. And truthfully, God calling you from your past, whatever that looks like, is a complete act of grace. But I want to challenge you to not keep that act of grace that God showed you to yourself, but rather let it mobilize you to share of his grace with other people. Let's worship together.